Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're all here. I'd like to especially thank our three panelists who are generously joining us at a time when their expertise is in very high demand. I'm going to introduce our three panelists, and then we will begin with some questions, and then we're going to open it up to everyone. Dr. Lynne Viola is an award-winning professor at the University of Toronto, specializing in 20th century Russian political and social history. Her research interests include gender, political culture, and violence in the era of Stalin. She has written 5 books, including Stalinist Perpetrators on Trial, Scenes from the Great Terror in Soviet Ukraine, published by Oxford University Press in 2017, and The Unknown Gulag, The Lost World of Stalin's Special Settlements, also Oxford University Press, published in 2007. Dr. Viola has also written over 30 articles and has edited or co-edited 19 books. Dr. Maria Sonevytsky is an associate professor of anthropology and music at Bard College in New York State. Previously, she was an associate professor of music at UC Berkeley. Dr. Sonevytsky has done fieldwork in Crimea and Western Ukraine. Her work explores practices of sovereignty in post-Soviet Ukrainian ethnomusic, the legacy of Soviet cultural policies, and folklore and nuclear experience after Chernobyl. John Vsetecka is a PhD candidate at Michigan State University. He is joining us today from Warsaw, Poland, and until recently was conducting research in Kyiv on a Fulbright grant. Mr. Vsetecka is a specialist in Soviet and East European history, global communism, and memory. His work explores how people make sense of tragedies and come to terms with difficult pasts. His dissertation, tentatively titled In the Aftermath of Hunger, Rapture, Response, and Retribution in Soviet Ukraine, 1933 to 47, examines the 1932 to 33 famine in Ukraine and its immediate and long-term effects. John is also the founder and co-editor of H Ukraine, part of the Humanities and Social Sciences HNet platform. So thank you all for joining us today. I wondered if we could begin with all three of you telling us perhaps a little bit more about your research, your experiences doing research in Ukraine, and Lynne, in your case, in Russia, and how you began studying this region. Lynne, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you very much, Sarah. I am, as Sarah said, a historian of modern Russia, and particularly the Stalinist 1930s. And I was always a Russian historian until roughly around 2014. And we know what happened in 2014. Russia invaded and has occupied Crimea, as well as moving into eastern provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk. For me, that was an important moment in deciding to go to Ukraine. I was also following the archives, work in Ukrainian archives, which, unlike Russian archives, were quite open. And so I worked with an international collaborative team in Ukraine that included Ukrainian scholars, but also 2 Russian scholars. And we worked very well together and have put out 6 volumes of documents. So my way to Ukraine was through a kind of different route than most. But now I consider myself a Ukrainianist, if only in principle. And I did just sever my ties to the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, where I had a position which had been going on for about 5 years. So that's it.
Thank you, Lynne. Maria?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know it can be really hard to feel connected to atrocities that are happening on the other side of the earth in a place that you may not have any personal connection to. So I'm grateful for the show of care and solidarity, even just by being here. So I am a heritage Ukrainian researcher of Ukraine. My parents were refugees from Soviet power and Nazi power and immigrated after World War II as displaced persons to North America, to Canada and the US. And I was born in this country. I was the first generation born in this country into a very anti-Soviet Ukrainian diaspora family. It's a typical story for people of my generation. As a scholar, I started my research relationship in Ukraine when I began grad school in 2004. So that's now an ongoing relationship for over 15 years. And as part of that work, I've actually spent a lot of time trying to engage in what I sometimes think of as a decolonial exercise of trying to unlearn in order to relearn. And so I'm an anthropologist, which means I spend a lot of time with very regular people, and I talk to them and I hang out with them and I try to understand how they think and feel. And so I have tried my best to understand how ordinary Ukrainians, and especially Ukrainians who are musicians, think about their relationship to the project of the Ukrainian state, which we can talk about more, which has been a complicated space to be in and now is at threat of extinction.
Thank you, Maria. John?
Good evening to everyone from Warsaw. I apologize in advance. My internet is a little unstable. And as you might be able to tell, I'm coming to you live from my bathroom. And the reason for this is I have people that just crossed the border living with me, a young family with a 1-month-old, and they happen to be very good friends of mine. And that, I think we can talk about this, speaks to the reality of the situation for all of us and the effects that are starting to trickle into the rest of the world from this war. So I am a historian by training. I am a 5th-year graduate student at Michigan State University, and I was in Ukraine until the end of January when I was evacuated out due to the threat of war, which has unfortunately come true. And I'm a researcher of the 1932-33 famine in Soviet Ukraine, now often and necessarily called the Holodomor. And I am also a scholar of the 1946-47 post-war famine. So I'm really a historian of famine in Soviet Ukraine, a very dark topic. And I was there working in the archives and doing research for my dissertation until I was interrupted. And now I'm in Warsaw, Poland, working with refugees coming to Poland and helping them get residences, accommodation, money, rides, anything that they could possibly need while they cross the border. And I am here indefinitely helping with that until I can go back to the US, where I hope I can resume with my research after being cut short in my research here abroad.
Thank you, John. I'm wondering if we could sort of do a question and each of the panelists could answer. Could you share with us what you see as experts as the most important part of your work or part of Russian or Ukrainian history or culture in understanding any one of the Russian-Ukrainian relationship today, or the resistance that we're seeing of the Ukrainian people, or Lynne, I'm thinking of you in particular, Putin's leadership and the political culture of Russia today. Lynne, could you take that question first?
Sure. It's hard to isolate a single factor. It's hard to say what's most important, but as somebody who has spent most of my life doing Russian history, I'm still looking at Russian leaders as key, and certainly Putin is. And I think it's really important to remember that this current tragic war did not happen overnight, that it goes back. And Putin has been nursing grievances against Ukraine and the West for many years. It's important to know that in 2005, so this is before the invasion of Crimea in 2014, he said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And so what we're seeing is basically revanchism. And by that, I mean an attempt to reconstitute borders, safety zones, and he thinks of nothing of Ukraine but as a safety zone. But it's also somehow hatred of Ukraine, particularly since 2014. And you can see this being worked out now. I mean, major cultural institutions and monuments are being destroyed. And Putin is very much identifying his legacy with this war, which, increases its danger. But it's basically a little bit like the Sun King of France, L'État c'est moi. He has identified himself fully with the destiny of Russia, not for better, but for worse. And so he is, as Anne Applebaum has suggested, an imperial nostalgist. He is creating an empire, and he is consciously setting it against the West. I'll leave it at that.
John, could you talk perhaps about the 1932 to 33 famine in this context? Did we lose John?
I think we may have lost the connection.
Well, we'll keep an eye out for him. Maria, could you go next?
Sure, yeah, I can talk a little bit about resistance and the history of that. I'm not the historian here, but I do some history of music in particular. So the example I might point to, and Lynn, please understand this is broad strokes, but is to think as far back as the 17th century, when there's a repertoire of what we could consider anti-imperial songs. This was before there was a modern Russian state. This was before there was a modern Ukrainian state. This was before there were any modern states, right? But there was a collective of Ukrainian kozaki. Many Ukrainians considered them freedom fighters. These were kind of bands of men, usually on horseback in the steppe parts of Ukraine, on the left bank in the eastern regions. And they had a lot of different kinds of songs that they sang. Some of them were really bawdy, actually. So if you're interested in that, you could go deep into that. But they also had this genre of song that was a kind of psalm and also a historical song. And there's this 17th century song text called "There Is No Truth in the World." It's eerily relevant to the moment. It's about how the powerful vanquish the truth. And it's a lament for the end of the Cossack order as it was being threatened by the Russian Empire. So again, I'm not trying to say that this is a modern Ukrainian story, but it points to a long history of Ukrainian resistance and critique of Russian power. And we can look at many examples subsequently where Ukrainians resisted, fought against Russian domination. And then in the Soviet 20th century, we can maybe point to the example that it was in many ways Ukraine which led to the dissolution of the Union when a massive referendum voted to leave the Soviet Union. So we should understand that Ukrainians have been fighting for freedom from Russian subjugation for centuries. And again, I'm painting in very broad strokes. So if you're a historian of this period, you know that I'm glossing over a lot. But I think the fact that Putin seems to have miscalculated the degree to which Ukrainians would resist is one of the more shocking elements of what is happening, to be totally honest. The historical record would have suggested that he would understand that Ukrainians wouldn't gladly embrace Russian invaders as their liberators, but instead try to fight them off tooth and nail to the death in the name of a free Ukraine. And that is unfortunately what we're now seeing as this conflict escalates.
Thank you, Maria. John, are you back with us?
Yes, I'm back. I'm sorry about that.
Could you perhaps speak to the famine in 1932 to 33 and how that informs your understanding of what we're seeing now in terms of both Ukrainian resistance and the assault on Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. In thinking about the Ukrainian resistance to Russia, and it's got a long history, as both Maria and Lynn have talked about. And as someone who grew up, I was finishing my master's thesis when Maidan happened, and I just gotten back to the U.S. actually from Ukraine before it broke out, and I was watching people get shot on live television as I'm writing the conclusion to my master's thesis on the famine. And like Lynn now, I've been working in the SBU archive, which I pray makes it through this, because it is a target right now for Russia. And I go back even further to the 1930s, 1940s on resistance, of which great literature written about actually. But in terms of the famine, I'm somebody who works on the aftermath, and I question the degree to which these types of tragedies come to an end and how people grapple with the effects that continue to reverberate. And in looking at this, going to the SBU archive and reading criminal files from, the Soviet secret police, these are things that Russia did not want people to read, and certainly Putin doesn't want people to read. And it's quite ironic, if he had actually, done some historical research of his own, he may have had a better speech. But the reality is he's not well informed, or at least he refuses to be. And so, looking at these criminal files from the 1930s and 1940s, there are people after the famine. It's a common misconception that after millions of people died in 1932-33, that people were silent. And this is not exactly true. Of course, it was forbidden to talk about, yes, but in private spheres, there were discussions going on. And before I was evacuated, I was working with lots of files where Ukrainians are writing poetry. Many who survived the famine went to school, they went to universities, and they started these poetry clubs, which is really fascinating. And they would talk to each other about the famine, and they would talk about their kind of will to persevere and the resistance to the Soviet Union, particularly to the Russians. And they were talking about what had been done to them. And what I really see through that is, not only in my own work about making sense of suffering, essentially, but enduring. And the fact that there's so much resolve in Ukraine and in Ukrainians, I think you can point to one of these moments. Of course, it's not just 1932-33, or even the earlier famine that took place in 1921 or 22, or even the famines that took place in the imperial period before that, or the micro famines that took place in between. But these sort of defining moments in our historical trajectory are fundamental for us to understand that, in fact, Ukraine has a long history of being stoic and resolved and understanding what's happening to them. For me, resistance doesn't always come with arms in hand. Resistance comes from writing, from poetry, from dissent. And there's a strong culture of this in Ukraine. And we can trace this, as far back as you'd like, and as far as forward as today. And so I see that while there's not a direct connection exactly, of course, to the 1930s as there is today, right? These are different events, but history informs us, and you can definitely make parallels, and you can make understandings based on what we're finding in these archives. And the research that people like Maria does on music, and the research that Lynne has done on pretty much everything. But for me, especially the Great Terror, and this is a time too in the late 1930s, when another moment when, especially in Soviet Ukraine, Ukrainian ideas of resistance and challenge to the Soviet state are ultimately really suppressed and oppressed. But ironically, it's when we find out about the resistance through things like poetry and writings and journals and conversations that are taking place. So for me as a historian, I think you can make the case that this resistance, at least for me, we can trace it right back to the 1930s, and see the same kind of resolve that was taking place there, taking place now in 2022.
John, for people who have never heard of the famine in the 1930s, could you give us a bit of a primer? And then Adriana has a question.
Yeah, of course, this is a big topic. So I'll do my best here in just a quick moment to kind of understand this. But there in the Soviet period, there was a policy right after the Soviet Union formed in the mid 1920s that there was going to be a push for this, this 5-year plan that would ultimately take the first 5-year plan that would take place between 1928 and 1932. And this ultimately, in a general sense, I'll try and keep this as general as possible, the Soviet Union needed to industrialize, and it was a way for them to fund. They needed to fund. They need to raise money and fund for their industrial projects. And one of the ways they were going to do this was to reform their agricultural sector into what was called collective farms. And again, Ukraine has a strong history of independent farming and rural workers. And what happened is the Soviet Union ultimately put people into what were called, these collective farms, these kolhosps, and they essentially had to provide everything that they were, reaping in the fields for the state. And what was happening is all of this grain and wheat and other things across the Soviet Union end up getting sent to places like Moscow, where they're stored in these huge containers, which are then sold to the rest of the world. And as you can imagine, the Soviet Union takes far more than they needed. This is not an environmental disaster by any means. There was a good crop. And what happens is in these collective farms, any food that was left for these, these rural workers, these peasants, these farmers, it got progressively more violent, and these things were confiscated from these farmers, and ultimately they starved, and millions of people starved, within actually like pretty much less than a 2-year period when most of this really hits. But over the course of 2 years, this collectivization campaign really gets violent, and food, and I mean, it's not just food that's taken from them, it's pretty much everything that they have, and these people are left pretty much to die and to starve, while the Soviets are selling this kind of grain and wheat exports abroad to help fund their kind of industrial push. And so in a very general way, that's kind of what happens in the 1930s. And this is sensitive because this follows a bigger famine that took place in the greater kind of Soviet area before it was kind of the Soviet Union in the early 1920s. And then, of course, there's a third major famine in 1946-47 after World War II. And so there are, these are kind of the areas of what I study are these 3 major famines, but the one in 1932, 1933 is arguably the most important and the most understood and hopefully the most known in history. And, I teach, at Michigan State, and every year there are students that have never heard of this. And so we still have a lot of work to do. Don't get me wrong, I understand. I was one of those students as an undergraduate too. And maybe we can talk about that later, of how I came to study this as an American, someone who is not Ukrainian, and became involved kind of for the rest of my life on this topic.
Thank you, John. And actually, I want to tie your perspective and just the things that you mentioned already about how you become more interested in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And just to have a broad sense or a general sense, because I know that there are some students here that are not necessarily in political science or history, so maybe it's the first time that they are hearing about Ukraine or this war in Ukraine. So I just wanted to ask you in a general sense, what exactly are the motivations of Russia today in 2022 to invade Ukraine? I mean, I know that this is not the first time that Russia is invading Ukraine. We have the history of the invasion of 2014, then, the movements in 2004 and all the years after that. Some political scientists actually, when they are talking about Ukraine, start in 1991 to explain Ukraine, right? While historians go centuries and centuries back to explain what's going on in Ukraine. So in a nutshell, for someone that doesn't know much about Ukraine, can you explain what exactly is going on here, or maybe the intentions of Russia in Ukraine today in 2022?
Lynne, do you want to take that question?
Sure. Thank you. This is not an easy question. I do want to follow up, though. My colleagues have spoken about Ukraine's long history, and this is very true. But I also think what we're talking about now in modern Ukraine, and certainly post-2014 Ukraine, is less an ethnic nation than a political nation. And that is, right now, it's not just Ukrainians who are resisting, it is Russians who are resisting, it is Ukrainian Jews who are resisting. There are vast numbers of people who identify with the Ukrainian state. So I think it's also important to keep that in mind. And this is the success, really, of the Ukrainian nation, sadly, ironically. Now, in terms of intentions, of course, I go back to Russia. And, Putin is a historical revisionist in the worst sense of the word. I like revisionists in some sense, in the sense of people who try and challenge history. But he's a falsifier, in fact. And like far-right nationalists everywhere, including Canada and the United States, he seeks to use a distorted sense of the past to justify the present. So some of you might have heard Putin talking about denazification of Ukraine. And we all hate Nazis, right? We should hate Nazis. But this is just a false argument. It's a veneer to cover what is basically an anti-Western and anti-Ukrainian war. There are right-wing groups in Ukraine, there's no doubt, and there's a history behind them, but they are so small in number. And I think there might be one representative of a far-right group in the parliament. So this is nonsense, what Putin is saying. But I do think we should take very seriously his talk about uniting the Russian-speaking world. And he's been talking a lot about this, while at the same time denying that Ukraine is a nation. And of course, if you deny Ukraine is a nation, you get rid of the problem, right? So we're going to unite Ukraine and maybe others, let us hope not others. He sees Ukraine as a country without a history. Now, you've already gotten a little sense from my colleagues that it has a very, very long and deep history. So this is not true. And of course, he's also reacting to NATO expansion. And we can't forget about that. NATO opened its doors, particularly to Georgia and Ukraine in 2008. And that was the same year that he said Ukraine's not even a state. But he is afraid of NATO. And he probably has good reasons to be afraid of NATO. And I don't know if NATO had taken this grievance seriously enough. But now it is beyond NATO, and it is a war, to destroy Ukraine. Certainly we've seen cultural genocide. But it is also a war with the West and with Western democracies. And I think the key thing to keep in mind now, as students of history, as students of political science, as American citizens, is that war crimes are being committed. We have good evidence that Putin's army is using cluster munitions, which are a terrible thing. And also, we have seen reports that there is the machinery for vacuum bombs, which are something that I can't begin to describe. But these are both weapons that have been outlawed in the world. I mean, all weapons should be, in my opinion, although I shouldn't talk to Americans like this. But these especially are the weapons that are lethal. And even US military officers have been describing them with horror. So, what has started as his attempt to create a Russian world is ending up as a massive war crime.
Lynn, thank you. Maria, I have a question for you, something that sort of brings what we're talking about really close to home. This past weekend, Saturday Night Live opened the show with the Ukrainian Chorus Dumka of New York singing Prayer for Ukraine. Could you share with us a bit of the history of this song?
Sure. And can I just respond briefly to something that
Please.
Lynn said, and maybe Lynn, you can correct me if I have this wrong, because I think the NATO expansion part is very important to keep in mind, and this was a strategic mistake. But at this moment in history, in March of 2022, I do not believe there's any justification to say that something NATO did right now has triggered this action. So I want us to be really mindful of the fact that this can be used right now as a kind of red herring. And Lynn, I think that's not what you are doing, because I agree that we need to keep NATO in the picture. But in terms of the justification of what may turn into a genocide, I do not think that anything that has recently happened has triggered or motivated.
Absolutely agree.
Okay, great. I just wanted to clarify. I also just want to vociferously agree with Lynn's earlier comment about conceiving of Ukraine not as an ethnic nation state, which it has never been, never in its history. It's always been multi-ethnic, multi-confessional, many different languages. But particularly some of the very powerful alliances we've seen in recent decades between historical enemies like the Crimean Tatars and the Ukrainians, who have formed these very powerful bonds of solidarity, really in opposition to Russian subjugation, is something to be mindful of. And there are many other examples of that as well. Okay, Sarah, your question about the song. Yeah, so did anybody see that Saturday Night Live performance? Most of you didn't see it. Oh, I wish I'd queued it up because I could have played it for you. So this is a song, I have it right here, which is why I'm looking. Molitva za Ukrainu, Bože veliki jedini. It's a prayer for Ukraine. And it's the music of Mykola Lysenko, who was a very, very important figure in Ukrainian music history, a 19th century ethnographer. He collected a lot of traditional music and also wrote very important songs, including Carol of the Bells. You know that one? Da, 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 right? That's a Ukrainian song originally. And so what this is it's arranged also by Alexander Koshitz, who is also the person who popularized Carol of the Bells in North America, in New York at Carnegie Hall in 1922. So this is a 4-part SATB, if anyone here sings in a choir. It's a 4-part arrangement for choir. And it is a prayer for Ukraine. It is a prayer for, it's a kind of second anthem for many Ukrainians. It's a prayer to God that Ukraine be protected and that it survive. I get emotional talking about this. And that it survive for many years. And I'm going to stop there for now.
Maria, thank you. I have a question for John. And at this point, I'm going to ask those of you that have questions to use the reaction function to raise your hand so that we can start calling on some of you in a second. John, you were in Kyiv until very recently. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the Ukrainians that you know there and what you were hearing from them, including the people who showed up recently with you in Poland, and or if you could talk about how you as an American came to be interested in Ukrainian history.
Sure. I'll do my best to be quick about all of that. So let me start actually with your last points of how I became involved, just because I think that there are a number of undergraduates here. And I always think that when I was an undergraduate, I was always interested in how people came to study the things that they do. And I'm still interested in that, actually, of course. And so the way that I became interested in Ukraine was by complete accident. Let's put it this way, Ukraine wasn't on my mental map when I was in college. And I come from a Czech family. And so, I mean, it's not that Eastern Europe or Central Europe was away from me in any means. It just, that's as far east as I would go in my head and physically. So I took a lecture in Soviet history as an undergraduate with a guy named Steven Siegel, who is a professor of Ukrainian history and Slavic studies and cartography, and he's an excellent person. And he turned out to be my mentor and advisor at this university. And he gave a lecture actually on the 1932-33 Holodomor. And I left that lecture almost in tears, basically, because I had learned what happened. And I felt embarrassed because I had never heard of this, right? I was also taking a history of the Holocaust course. So of course, it's like, there's nobody that hasn't heard of this, of the Holocaust. And then I learned about Holodomor, and I feel just like I need to know more. So I end up writing my term paper on that. Then I write my undergraduate honors thesis on that, then an MA thesis, now a dissertation. It's kept going. It's snowballed quite into a mass. And it took one lecture to do that to me. And I found that quite important, because I'm sure some of you will perhaps be able to put Ukraine on your mental maps now. One thing I encourage people too is, it's okay if you don't know anything about Ukraine right now. You're learning, and it's okay to admit that this stuff is new. You can't obviously know everything about everywhere in the world all the time. And so I think for me, my big plea right now is to just pay attention and learn and listen to experts who have been working on Ukraine for a long time. And you have, I wouldn't even call myself an expert. I'm still not done with the PhD, but you have two other, wonderful individuals here whom you can consult. And so fast forward to my PhD, and I'm in Kiev until it's March now. So the end of January, life was great there the whole time I was there. And actually, up until I left, I didn't want to leave. I had to leave under an evacuation order from the Department of State. And everything was really good. I have my friends there. I still have an apartment there. I'm registered there. I have you have to get when you live there as a foreigner, you have to get this temporary residence permit called a Vsetecka, and it's actually quite of a bureaucratic nightmare. And so when you get this, you feel very proud, and you have to register at your apartment. And I'm still registered there, actually, but I'm not sure that the Ukrainian government will give me too much trouble after this is all over. But I say this because I check in with my landlord every day. Landlords are usually people you don't like, or perhaps not love so much. But I do love my landlord, and she's there with her husband. They live right across the street from me. I lived in a neighborhood in Ukraine called Podil, it's kind of in the lower part of the city, right on the river. It's a kind of trendy, hip area to be. It's a really lovely place, lots of cafes. And when I saw the picture the other day of smoke coming out of that neighborhood in Podil, I messaged her right away, and this is now the daily routine. In between helping people get settled in Poland, it's messaging folks that are, in bomb shelters. I'm messaging them every day. Some are teaching from there. Kids are still learning from there. University classes still go on in some parts of the country from bomb shelters, if you can imagine that. And I think that speaks volume to the resolve of the Ukrainian people. They're very stoic, and the people that I have been in touch with before I left, they thought we were crazy for leaving. They thought this would never happen. And many Ukrainians still to this day told me that they never thought it would happen until it actually happened. So there's some stubbornness there that they've admitted to this. I understand why, but that is the experience of people living there. Is they're living in bomb shelters most of the time. They're shell shocked. The people that are with me now have been talking about that. They're trying to adapt to life without hearing sirens and bombs every day, and hiding in closets and makeshift shelters with their 1-month-old daughter, which I don't think really any of us can imagine what that would be like. And so, this is the reality now of there's trauma that's happening already. There's shock, there's horror, and the people in Ukraine, I will say this, everybody I check in with every day, responds and is very happy, and they just want us to keep working for them and, collect donations and do everything we can. But they're very confident in their country, and they're very confident in a successful outcome on behalf of, Ukraine and the Ukrainian military. So I would say that there's a hope that no matter what happens, that will never be taken from them.
Thank you, John. And do we have any questions from students? Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yes, I have a question for Dr. Viola. So, Dr. Viola, you talk about like the many war crimes that Vladimir Putin is committing. But the question I have is, the soldiers that are serving under Russia, how could they really be okay with these, atrocities that they're committing? Like, is there like a certain like benefit that they believe they're going to be getting out of by invading Ukraine?
Thank you for the question, Peter. It's really hard to say. We've seen news that many of these soldiers are young conscripts and didn't really know what they were in for. Now, whether that's true and to what extent, I don't know. I have a feeling they were the sacrificial lambs that were sent in first. But have no doubt that he has many people who will fight for him. And of course, they're thinking the same thing that he has said, the same, let's call it false news, misinformation. So I think, like in all armies, it's very hard to resist the hierarchy. And we've seen some resistance, but how that will continue and how deep it will go is very, very difficult to say. The real thing is that these are two people who are so close together. I've seen a couple of amazing little clips about just crowds of everyday Ukrainians gathered, standing in front of formations of Russian machinery and not moving. And, to me, that's got to have some kind of an effect on the soldiers. But I think it's still too early to say, whether this is broader than the examples we've seen.
Thank you, Lynn. Albert?
Yes, this is a question for Dr. John. I'm just going to call you Dr. John because I don't want to butcher your last name or anything like that. But my question is kind of concerning the idea with what you call it again, famine and whatnot. And I was wondering if kind of like the idea of the canal that's currently in Crimea. I hope I pronounced it right. I was wondering if this is kind of like played a role in the Ukraine versus Russia thing, because that canal, from what I've heard, is basically only allowing like a limited supply of water, and it's kind of causing maybe some type of famine in the Crimea area. And would you say that definitely kind of played a role in the Ukraine versus Russia debacle?
Thanks, Albert. Thanks for a good question. And, Dr. John, hopefully next spring you could call me doctor, but you could just call me John for now.
Okay.
Great question. I think, look, the famine took place in the 1930s, and that's not what's happening today. But your point is well taken, because if you've been following the news, certain regions of Ukraine, particularly in Sumy and Kharkiv and other areas, are getting hit by supply chain issues due to war. And there is a real fear of food shortages. And I'm working with a lot of people to try and help find solutions to this. Although, this isn't my professional career. I'm an academic, and I'm learning the ropes with these humanitarian orgs that I'm working with. But there are fears of people going hungry and not having drinking water. Utilities are cut off. People are trying to stay warm. And no doubt, I've heard some murmurs of it already from people. Anytime there's a food shortage in Ukraine, there's not one person that forgets what has happened in the 1930s and the 1940s to them. Their grandmothers and parents tell these stories. And so absolutely, there's not a man-made famine right now, but there is, there's war that comes with hunger issues, and people are being starved, and this is intentional. And in fact, some of the Russian soldiers themselves are starving on the other hand. So there are food issues on both sides. But in a bigger capacity, the future of Ukraine as a top kind of 5 exporter of grain, I think, I don't remember exactly what number they are, but they're already anticipating huge supply issues out into the country. And I haven't been reading or listening to too much American news, but there's, a fear in the beer industry about, barley shortages due to the war that would come from Ukraine. And so there's definitely going to be connections there of people going hungry as a result of what's happening. And no doubt, Albert, I agree 100% that people are going to look back to a long history of hunger and starvation in their country as pointing to another round of this that's happening in 2022. But yeah, thanks for the great question.
Oh yeah, thank you for answering.
Samuel?
Thank you, Dr. King. I'm not certain who to address this to. I'm imagining that Dr. Viola or Sonevytsky, I think, might be able to answer this one. I'm very interested in how I can be continually best informed in this situation, and also what the information within the Russian state is likely to be like. So with our ability to access various different news sources, what are the most reliable sources that we can access, and what can we expect to hear from people, everyday Russians? What are they going to be being fed? What is their information system going to look like? And how do we interact with that in the future?
Lynn, is it okay if I attempt take the
Yeah,
first crack?
I think my colleague will be better informed about the Ukrainian sources. For Russian sources, all you have to do is read Putin's speeches, Google Putin's speeches, and you'll start to see how he has created a alternative world of history. But there are a couple of still independent sources. Rain was taken off the air, but I think you can still find Rain. I think it's back on YouTube.
Oh, wow.
So that would be a good source to get the Russian to get a good Russian source, which is independent of the state and very anti-state, in fact.
On the Ukrainian side, and I'm actually really curious to hear what John would offer here, but I've been really inspired by the work of the journalists of the Kyiv Independent. This is easy to find. They have quite a presence at the moment. Independent. And these are actually journalists who are, this is a recently formed organization. These are people who defected from the Kyiv Post, actually. This is an interesting story on its own, but for the moment, what's important is that these are journalists who are doing, I think, pretty rigorously researched reporting. They're risking their lives to provide reliable updates. And so for the Ukrainian side, I think that this is a really, really good place to go. John, would you agree with that? And do you have other suggestions?
No, I agree 100%. I follow the Kyiv Independent religiously, and they are, I think, like up to the second on every breaking news, and they verify everything, which is another point that we need to just make sure that we understand is there's a lot of news that floats out there, and I see major outlets in the US leak things before they're verified and then they're taken down. And so the Kyiv Independent is full of a team of incredible reporters that are in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, and they corroborate their information like in time that I'm not even sure is possible as a human, but they do it. So follow them on Twitter. They tweet everything instantaneously, and it is the most up-to-date news source that I've seen. I would also recommend too, like beyond just kind of this news, if you want to study other aspects of this, you can read like the OSCE reports from people in the field that are documenting war crimes and other violations in real time. You can follow these reports as well if you're interested in that aspect. But definitely, you should subscribe to the Kyiv Independent, and if possible, support them, because it'll be the best investment you'll make in understanding Ukrainian media in real time.
Thank you for pointing me in the right direction.
Nathan?
Hi, so I'm not really sure who to address this question to, but I was wondering more about the separatist movement in Eastern Ukraine, like leading up to this Russian invasion. Like, how much of that movement was like based on genuine grievances, like with the Ukrainian government, and how much is just pretty much a front, more or less, for Russia to pretty much get involved in Ukrainian politics?
Nobody wants to take it because it's very hard. Can I give it a stab and then you can correct me? So I think that the answer is that it's very hard to know, but also that there is very clear evidence that the Russian state provided soldiers who crossed the line, military support, including the Buk missile that shot down the airplane heading to Malaysia. Right, it was heading to Malaysia from Amsterdam, I believe. And and there's considerable information to suggest that people at the top levels close to Putin were actually dictating many aspects of who should be the leaders in the so-called People's Republics. So it's really hard to lay down a percentage, right? But the fact that there's definitive evidence that Russian participation stoked these at minimum and created them at maximum is there. Putin has always denied this basically, right? And said that these were spontaneous and these were reactions to what he called a fascist coup, the same event that most Ukrainians would call the Maidan Revolution or the Revolution of Dignity. So, the last questioner was asking about where to find reliable news sources. And I just want to underscore that this is a profoundly important question because the competing narratives they offer just like a complete reverse view, right? A kind of through the looking glass version of reality. And so that would be my attempt at an answer.
Lynn, John, do either of you want to respond to that as well?
I was just going to add on, I 100% agree with everything that Maria said. This is something too that, we should start doing now. I think terminology matters incredibly right now. And so my colleagues, feel free to disagree with me, but this is a war in my opinion, and this is war that's happening. And the reason I say this is if you look back and 8 years ago, this is, as Maria poignantly said, the invasion happened in 2014. So the invasion did not start this past Wednesday when the bombs started dropping. This invasion started previously. And so I think it's important that we remember this war, this what's going on has been going on for 8 years. And people in Ukraine understand that. And it's just something I want to reiterate to Maria's point of this isn't, for those of us who have been, working with people for the past week, it feels like this has been going on forever. But this war and the invasion, which you could argue is a pretext for war, starts in 2014, and so this has been going on for several years. And I think it's just always poignant to remember that this is the case.
Thank you, John. Layla?
Yes, hi. This question kind of go towards anybody who feels the need to answer, but I kind of want to go back and ask about something we were talking about earlier. It was mentioned that when talking about like Ukrainian resistance, like over time, that Russians themselves had been resisting as well. And I just wanted to know, like, in what ways did Russians resist, I guess, and like, has Putin responded in any way or tried to handle that? How's he gone about it?
Well, could I try this? If we're talking about resistance now, there's a huge difference in the way Russians reacted in 2014 and the way some Russians are reacting now. I think we're still talking about a very tiny minority that is actively resisting on the streets, but they're mostly young people. And I think young people, particularly urban young people, are appalled by their government and appalled by what's going on. Whereas in 2014, people had a sense, well, Crimea is back, Crimea is ours. And it was a very sort of casual ignoring of the rule of law, to put it mildly. But now I'm seeing people use the word shame constantly. I am ashamed at what is going on. there have been about 6,500 arrests at a minimum of Russians, again, mostly young, but there have been very elderly people out there protesting too. But make no mistake, I don't think they're going to bring down the government. I mean, it'd be lovely to see that happen, but I don't think that's going to happen. I do think, apart from that 6,500, there are large numbers of students, intellectuals, certain professionals who are, again, ashamed and appalled at what is happening. But it will always only be a very tiny number that will protest in the streets. But there's no question they're very, very brave because they are going to be arrested. And, they're talking about introducing martial law now within Russia, which is very interesting. I think it speaks volumes that they have to resort to that. Now, if this were such a glorious reunion with brothers, Slav brothers in Ukraine, they would not have any need for martial law.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nick?
Hi, first just wanted to say thank you very much, Mr. Vsetecka, Drs. Viola and Sonevytsky for coming and speaking today. I wanted to ask you, because it sounded like all three of you have experience traveling either across the Ukrainian border or the Russian border. Kind of what was the process before, either before 2014 or since, but before the current conflict for international travel there? I'm sure we've all seen the headlines that refugees and those fleeing the area are predominantly fleeing to Poland, sorry, my throat, and I believe Romania and Moldova. But was this especially onerous? Are we supposed to be expecting backups at the borders? And apologies if it's kind of a very general question, but I couldn't find anything definitive online.
Maybe I'll start here since I'm here working on the borders. So look, I've got a couple, as I mentioned, with a baby that just crossed, and they were very fortunate the other day to have a very fast crossing, which was still only a few hours. So I mean, in normal time, a few hours is still a decently long amount of time to do something. And before this, and at other busier border crossings. Look, it's tragic how hard it is to get across borders right now in terms of time. The average wait time at some of the borders still, I think, is about 2 days, and that's just at the border. That's after you get to the border. You have to stand in line. It's, you have to drive. You have to remember when you go through the border, for example, to Poland and other countries, you have to go through the Ukrainian customs first, then you have to go to like this kind of middle area before you go through Polish customs and to get into the country. So it's a multi-stage process at the border. And it's hard. If you're driving, you have to make sure you have enough fuel, you have to make sure you have enough food, because these things are in short supply on the Ukrainian side. And things have gotten really well organized on the Polish side. So when they get across, people have been providing water and food and snacks and bathrooms. I had dinner with a journalist that just got here from Ukraine the other night, and she hadn't used the bathroom in I think 23 hours or something. So when she got into Poland, they were just so happy to be able to use a bathroom, right? So these kind of basic human things that we take for granted every day, they're desperate for. And I met up with a mother who brought her 2 kids over recently. And of course, her husband stayed because he's between the ages of 18 and 60. And if you're a Ukrainian male between those ages, you have to stay in Ukraine and fight. You can't leave the country. And so there's a lot of women with children here in Poland, not only here, but in Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and elsewhere. And she told me, this sticks with me, she said that she felt humiliated having to go, she was humiliated going through this process of having to leave her home, having to make sure her kids could eat when otherwise she could provide very regularly for them. And most importantly, she felt humiliated that she had to leave her home, meaning Ukraine, and didn't quite understand why she had to leave her home. And she, very understandably wants the Russians to leave her home. So these types of processes on the border right now are very hectic. You're also just dealing with whoever you get on the border that day. And I know at some places, they're processing 100,000 people a day across borders, and they only have a couple of people working the customs lines at some of those borders at a time. So it just takes forever. So if that gives you some indication of how the borders are now, it gives you some insight. We're now tonight, just before I got on, we're over 1 million people that we can count as refugees that have left Ukraine. And that number that happened a week and a day basically into this war. So they're predicting that this could be in the millions, right, in the plural, very, very soon. And I predict, it's hard to know, but I imagine that the borders are just going to get more and more crowded as we go on.
Can I add? So John, thank you so much for that perspective, and really thank you for all the work that you're doing. I'm amazed at the organizing that's happening, and so grateful for it. I just recently had my own friends cross the Polish border. I can say that after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, the travel to Crimea became challenging. I did years of field work in Crimea, actually, with Crimean Tatar musicians. The Crimean Tatars are the predominantly Sunni Muslim indigenous population of Crimea. And so I used to travel there by train or by airplane from Kyiv. From Kyiv, the flight took an hour. After 2014, you could no longer travel really from mainland Ukraine. And so the only time I returned after the annexation was in 2015, and I flew from St. Petersburg to Simferopol, which is the capital of Crimea. And because we had to go around, right, so you can imagine there's a kind of straight line down through basically the middle of Ukraine, we had to go around Ukrainian airspace. So it was like a 5-hour flight. And it was a scary trip. It was a scary time to be there, and I wasn't sure that it was a very smart move on my part, but I wanted to see my friends there, and I have not been able to return since. And then what I can also say is that I'm a person that crossed the border many, many times in many other directions before 2014, and that was usually a fairly swift and easy journey. I actually crossed by foot into the Polish border many times, because sometimes that was just the fastest way. The trains are kind of slow. They sit on the border for a long time. They used to. And that was usually like pretty easy breezy, honestly. I mean, I have an American passport, so that helps, of course. But what we're hearing now about these 40-kilometer lines of people waiting, it's and passing their children through the border, and it's also so immensely heartbreaking.
Thank you. Ian, and at this point, I'm going to ask if there's any faculty or staff who are here who have questions. If you would like to raise your hand, we'll get to you when we've finished with our student questions. Ian, go ahead.
I just want to first off say that I'm very uneducated on this topic, and this is why I love this Q&A and everything. So really my big question is, it might be very broad, but I was curious about what was the inflection point, or the point at which it went from a standoff and a more standoffish to a full-blown assault onto the cities and the people inside of Ukraine, as well as, is there any historical context that could have previewed that this could have happened before this, and from a standoff to a full-blown conflict and war? As well, I say it's been a war the whole time, but more that big inflection point.
I'm hesitating. Ian, I think for someone who doesn't know much, this is like a really good and very hard question. I don't think there was an inflection point. I mean, what we saw was a long, long buildup by Putin's armies on the border under the pretext of a training operation. And then we started to see amazing intelligence coming out of the US government predicting everything that was going to happen, which is kind of scary. I don't know if they have an inside person again in Russia or not, but they predicted, everything that was going to happen. But whether there was just something that turned, I don't know. I'd be curious to hear if either of my colleagues could answer that. But you want to know what the trigger is, right? And that's really hard, but it's a good question, Anne.
Can I offer quickly that there are news reports in recent days suggesting that President Xi of China asked Putin to wait until the Olympics were over to begin the invasion. Is that an inflection point, or is that just a mind-boggling kind of set of circumstances? So in terms of when things escalated, I mean, I believe it was exactly a week ago, wasn't it? It was Thursday, I think, that they declared the republics free and then moved in so-called peacekeeping forces. And then it was that day too that they started to advance across the border. But this is a war of choice. I think that is also an important term here. This is a fully unprovoked, unjustified war of choice on Putin's behalf.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that Lynn and Maria have said. Just to provide, with some concrete dates here, which I think as a historian for me helped me make sense of this. Of last Wednesday, right? This is when the terminology that we're using right now is when the bombs started to drop. And I think that this is quite shocking for a lot of people that never, ever thought it would come to this. And I think to ruminate on kind of an inflection point is to try and get in Putin's mind, which is a terrifying endeavor and a very dangerous endeavor, and something that I'm not sure that any rational person can actually make sense of, because I'm not sure to what degree, any of this, it's hard to know how one is thinking here, let's put it this way. And so, I mean, there were people that thought, there was some talk like Maria mentioned about the Olympics. Actually, before the Olympics happened, there was some, this has kind of happened before. They thought that maybe they would not steal the spotlight from China, an ally of theirs. And it's very possible that this is the case. But also last week is when they officially recognized the new boundary lines of Luhansk and Donetsk, and actually pushed these borders not only from the red lines that they had invaded in 2014, but actually like the full oblast lines, which pushed it further into Ukraine and justified, in Russia's mind at least, their presence there. And so that seems to be a moment when they set it off. Although, as someone who was in Ukraine at the time, in January, there was intelligence months before that, even December and November, coming in about possible something happening by Russia. And there were murmurs of that, but no, you have to remember we were in the red zone in a pandemic, in COVID, and we were shut down. We were preoccupied with these things. And so how quickly we forget about the pandemic that's still ongoing. But there's intelligence, at least, that I'm not privy to, that said they had information far beyond, in 2021. And so there's a lot of things building up to this, and it's going to be key as we move forward, putting together exactly when we think this inflection point might have been. Although I agree with Lynn, I'm not sure that there's going to be just one inflection point. I think it's probably a combination of many.
Thank you. B, would you like to ask your question?
Hi. So we've obviously talked about Putin wanting to unite the Russian-speaking world, but God forbid, if Russia is successful, do you think that they would put in a regime that will limit the freedoms of the Ukrainians, like put certain restrictions or limits on them?
I always tell my students not to do what if history. And Professor King may remember that, since she was my undergraduate. At the same time, I can't help but note that before this invasion, Putin did something that's was very typical in the Stalin years. That is, he started to up the arrests of people with independent minds. He also, has civil society in Russia has been under attack for a very long time. But at the end of the 1990s, at the end of 2021, he closed down the international human rights organization called Memorial, which was created as a way to remember the victims of Stalinism. And this was probably the last straw, the last thing he could do. And so, I think things have been planned for a very long time. If, God forbid, he takes over in Ukraine, of course, there will be repression. We've heard already that there are lists of people who are going to be arrested. The Russian sort of I forget the word for it, but I mean, the Russian practice is to destroy utterly, preemptively, any possible kind of opposition. So I imagine that they have categories of people that they're thinking about, like academics, like cultural figures, like writers. Let's hope it never comes to that. But if it does, yeah, of course, there'll be massive repression.
Thank you.
And Brianna Waddle, did you have a question?
You are muted.
B, if you want to type your question into the chat, we'll ask it for you because I don't think we can hear you. I'm going to call on Matthew Dunlop because we haven't heard from him yet. Matthew.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, first of all, thank you to all the speakers who have come to this event. I just have a question, more specifically, I think, to Dr. Viola about the situation in Ukraine regarding, I think you mentioned denazification and Putin's stated goals. I've paid attention to this conflict for quite some years, and I know the groups that you would be mentioning about, I think Azov Battalion and Right Sector. And what I think a question to ask is, assuming Ukraine can at least stop the Russian invasion, because it hasn't gone particularly well for Putin, are there any concerns about what the Ukrainian government in terms of handing out weapons to civilians and these groups getting access to military capabilities, assuming a post-war Ukraine is still independent? What would the security concerns be for these types of groups like Azov and Right Sector retaining military armaments?
Although that was a question for me and a good question, Matthew, I'm not sure if I can answer it. And, I depend on my colleagues. I have a sense that these groups were pretty much marginalized in the years after 2014 as the general kind of state of historical consciousness in Ukraine evolved. And as for, weaponizing them, I think they already had weapons. So I can't speculate. I don't like these groups, no one should. But I also think that the idea that these groups would motivate Putin to invade and destroy is a farce and a lie. They're just not significant enough. I think in some ways, Canada's right wing is more significant. They managed to close down Ottawa for 3 weeks with the truckers' convoy. Make no mistake, these are dangerous groups, but I think they're just so small. Thank you.
Can I add a little bit? I agree with everything Lynne just said, and I want to underscore that these groups have been, Ukrainian society has been militarizing since 2014. Regrettably, in my view, I hold pacifist beliefs, but understandably also, given the violation of their territorial sovereignty. One of the things that has happened in the last week is that President Zelensky, who is Jewish, of Ukraine, has become a kind of media sensation. And it will be really fascinating to see how the post-war Ukrainian order, inshallah, plays out with the President Zelensky and a deeply patriotic and unified, almost historically unprecedentedly unified Ukrainian public plays out in the long term. I share concerns about the militarization of societies anywhere. And so I think it's a valid question, but it is hard to kind of forecast that far ahead at the moment. And I do really want to underscore again that while these groups exist, they are marginal power holders within the larger context of Ukrainian society. And so, what Putin's propaganda machine does very well is it points out something that has a little tiny kernel of truth to it, and it kind of builds it up into this huge phenomenon that then can be used to say something as ludicrous as we are invading Ukraine in order to denazify it.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Sarah, could I just come in with a little short story? In terms of not denazification, we could turn to the good people of Uman. Uman is a traditionally Jewish center in Ukraine, and in fact continues to be a place of pilgrimage for Hasidic Jews. And so hopefully some of you have seen the same thing I've seen, but there were these 80-year-old women, 90-year-old women hiding out in the basement of the Uman synagogue and cursing like truckers in regard to Putin. And with one of them saying, look, I was in Kiev in 1941. We don't need this. And they're furious. And they're basically saying, we don't have Nazis here.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question. Brianna Wardle tried to ask something before, but she experienced technical difficulties. She wanted to ask about the gravity of Switzerland breaking its neutrality to sanctions in Russia. She said that she have heard a lot about that, but she wanted to understand a little bit more the implications of these sanctions as a tool in foreign policy for the United States and other countries in the European Union, but also what consequences of these can have on Russia.
I'm not sure any of us here are like, and I don't want to speak for others, I'm certainly not a deep expert on this, but what I can share quickly is that it seems like a lot of Russian oligarchic wealth has been stored in Swiss banks. And so I think that this is significant. Of course, as with Germany increasing its defense budget, and as with Switzerland ending a very long period of neutrality, these are world historical events that we're witnessing.
I'll also just add, I think the significance, and I agree, I mean, I'm not an economist, but the more sanctions from more countries and more people, they make a presence, and they're going to help cripple the economy, which in my opinion is already crippling, and the effects remain to be seen in a full way, which I think we'll know sooner than later, and this will be something to watch out for, right? But for Switzerland to break neutrality as a harbor not only of Russian oligarchic wealth, but others around the world, this might perhaps, this might set a precedent for others who are on the fence about doing this. If one of the biggest hubs in the world is doing it, then others will certainly follow because they'll have the backing of what happened in Switzerland and other countries. And so it might inspire others to go ahead and do the same.
Can I call on Nick to ask your question?
Hi, this is just a question in general. At what point, if any, do you think Russian offerings for peace talks will become more genuine and less of like a stalling tactic to do military maneuvers? Because it feels like the international sanctions are a bit too heavy for them to put off for very long.
Personally, I don't think that Putin is going to stop, and I don't think he is going to pay attention to the peace initiatives. I wish I could answer with a more positive answer, Nick. I think he's going to destroy Ukraine.
Can I jump in and offer also that when they had the so-called peace negotiations, that was the exact moment when they escalated attacks on various Ukrainian cities, including Kharkiv. So, I mean, these were bad faith negotiations, which is a really mild way of putting it. Unfortunately, I have to sign off. And I'm so grateful for your really wonderful questions today. I saw that there was a question in the chat, and I'm not trying to close down the session. I just might personally have to go. And I saw that there was a question in the chat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in a very recently published New York Times article, which is an interview with the members of Dacha Bracha, which is a wonderful Ukrainian band that if you haven't checked out, I really recommend it. And some of their songs are linked in the article. It also has a link to my lecture that I gave yesterday about Ukrainian music and sovereignty. So you can check that out if you want to know more about, the questioner was Nick Fanchet. But if others are also interested in hearing a little bit more about my work, you can find that linked in the New York Times piece as well. Thank you, Dr. King, so much for organizing this. It was an honor to be on this panel with Lynne and John, and I'm praying for peace.
Dr. Sonevytsky, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. It was wonderful to hear from you, and our thoughts are with you.
Thank you for coming.
Daniel, can I ask you to ask your questions?
Sure. So I'm finishing my graduate degree in World War II studies, and I tend to either fortunately or unfortunately see a lot through that lens. I was struck by Putin's justifications being eerily reminiscent to Hitler's justifications when he invaded first the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia and eventually Poland, bringing all Germans together. I'm wondering if anyone has comments on that and whether I have an overactive imagination on this particular issue.
I could give it a try. John, do you want to start?
No, Lynn, you're the expert. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I'm not, in fact, but thank you. Look, I think you can see similarities. You probably will be able to see differences as well. But it is eerily familiar in terms of this sort of revanchist motivation. Hitler also, had grievances from World War I. And we see the same grievances, with Putin, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's quite clear that there are similarities in terms of revanchism. And of course, the other similarity is that in both cases, you have dictators who were willing to devastate these countries in the name of one supposed principle or another. And here we have this sort of fake idea of reuniting the poor suffering Ukrainians who have been under the thumb of Nazis, which is all, not only is it not true, it's absolutely absurd. So I think, you're at least partially right to see the similarities.
John, did you want to jump in on that question too?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. As a historian, right, I'm actually quite skeptical of looking back to sort of these moments in the past to inform our understanding of the present, just because they're different contexts, and there's a lot of talk about this being World War III right now, and looking back to World War II, and where I see a lot of comparisons, and I think this is a natural thing to do as a human to turn to what we understand and attempt to make sense, but there are a lot of fallacies in that, and it's a trap that I think we have to avoid. This is something that we need to understand this event on its own terms and understand the more immediate history that has led up to this. But in some sense, like if talking through World War II, I see these similarities too. This There's certainly these kinds of stab in the backs, right, and annexing territories. And, for example, I'm struck too when, we're talking about World War II and then the Holocaust as well. I mean, the Holocaust in many ways starts in Ukraine with the Holocaust by bullets. And we don't get to the camps until later. And so Ukrainian lands are central to this narrative in the 1930s and then of course the 1940s. And now it's quite interesting to me, as someone who studies maps, when we're thinking about World War II, for example, and the Holocaust in Lebensraum, right? This living space in the East. Now we're seeing Ukraine get pushed from the East to the West, right? And there are territories that are fighting for it. And it's again, and I can't help but love the name of the book by Serhiy Plohi, The Gates of Europe, both ways, right? It's the gate to Europe both ways. And it's playing out. And I'm not saying that there's a connection to World War II, a direct connection to this, but I understand the thinking of seeing it in these terms, and I agree with what Lynne said about, it's hard not to see some of the parallels for sure, as long as we understand that this is its own war and its own situation that's happening in 2022 and not in 1941.
Thank you both. Peter, we're going to have you ask your question, and then if we don't have any more hands, we're going to wrap this up. Peter, go ahead.
Yes. So let's just say, and God forbid, Russia does eventually win this war against Ukraine. How will the refugees be processed? Like what will be the situation? Which what will they do really? Like what's the procedure for managing them? Like, will they go back to Ukraine, or will they be dispersed to other countries, or will they just stay in Poland?
So you're talking to two historians, and we're notoriously bad about predicting the future. I don't. We have no idea what's going to happen with this, and again, I'm with Lynne about the what if, but it's a real question about what will happen to the people who have left, and I think that's what you're getting at, right? Do these people return home or not? And certainly, I think if this goes the wrong way, in my opinion, and Russia is able to win, I'm not sure how one does go back unless they're willing to concede to the concessions of that territory that are run by Putin or whoever he puts in power. There are rumors about Viktor Yanukovych coming back in because he was the legal president and then forced out. And this is a narrative that I've seen kind of getting leaked, but no one knows. But I don't know, I'm not Ukrainian, but if I were, I don't know how in the hell I would go back to a Ukraine that is not a Ukraine anymore in that sense, that's run by a dictator. And what will happen to these refugees? That's going to be on Europe and the United States and the West in many ways. Are they going to be able to adapt policies? They're being absorbed now, but for how long will countries remain open to them? What it means to lose a permanent home with this amount of people, right? There are about around 44 million people that inhabit Ukraine today. And as of this evening, 10 million of those are not living in their actual homes that they're supposed to be in Ukraine. It doesn't mean that 10 million people have left Ukraine, but 10 million people are displaced. So 1 in 4 Ukrainians essentially is already out of their home. And that's staggering. This is a week and a day into this. We're going to have to find solutions of places that they can go permanently, because a lot of people, I'm here in Poland, but people are here for a few nights or a week or something until they can go be with family or find jobs. It's a whole nother concern. And so what remains, we don't know. I certainly don't know what's going to happen. And it's, and unfortunately, I think in some ways out of our hands. It's going to be up to policymakers in a lot of cases, regrettably so, about what they're going to do to help these people. And certainly I want to help. And I know everyone here would like to do as much as they can. So I don't know, maybe Lynne has some thoughts on this too, but I have no idea how to predict what these people will do. And maybe some will want to go home. I mean, it is their home, their families are there. And if it's a way to see their families, there might be sacrifices they're willing to make to get home and be in their house if it's still standing. But the way things are going, I can't imagine wanting to return to that.
Yeah, probably wasn't the best question for you guys. I'm sorry about that, but yeah, I was just curious.
Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions, we're going to wrap this up. Lynn and John, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your expertise. This has been really beneficial. We really appreciate you. For those of you, if you haven't been checking the chat, we have been throwing a lot of resources in there. Dr. Boersner put together a list of resources for how to help in Ukraine, and also where to get information from on an external website that you can check out. And we've also put in there John and Maria's Twitter handles and Dr. Viola's faculty page. So please check out those resources. And thank you to all of you who came and asked wonderful questions. And again, special thanks to Dr. Boersner, who organized this with me, and Dr. Viola and John. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And may I just add, you have a wonderful group of students. I really appreciate the very informed questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so
John, be
much.
safe.
Thanks, Lynn. Nice to see you.